American spiritualism represents one of the most fascinating religious movements to emerge from 19th century America, characterized by its revolutionary claim that the living could communicate directly with the dead. This movement, which first gained widespread popularity in the 1840s, fundamentally challenged conventional religious orthodoxy while simultaneously embracing elements of scientific inquiry, social reform, and individual spiritual authority. The foundations of American spiritualism were laid through the work of figures like Andrew Jackson Davis, dubbed the Poughkeepsie Seer, and the Fox Sisters of Rochester, New York, whose purported spirit communications catapulted the movement into national consciousness. Despite later confessions of fraud by key figures, spiritualism's influence extended well beyond its immediate adherents, intersecting with women's rights, abolitionism, and religious liberalization, while leaving an indelible mark on American cultural and religious identity that continues to resonate in contemporary spiritual practices. The movement began through the influential writings of Emanuel Swedenborg, an 18th-century Swedish philosopher whose theological works significantly transformed Christian perceptions of the afterlife. Swedenborg's revolutionary conception of heaven departed dramatically from traditional Christian theology, which had portrayed the afterlife as a distant, austere realm primarily populated by God and angels, with limited accessibility for ordinary souls. Instead, Swedenborg envisioned heaven as a more perfect version of earth where the spirits of loved ones have passed on and continue to exist in familiar forms. This reconceptualization made the afterlife more accessible and relatable to ordinary believers, establishing a theological foundation upon which spiritualism would later build its practices and beliefs. By the time spiritualist practices emerged in mid-19th century America, Swedenborg's teachings had already taken root, creating fertile ground for a movement that promised direct communication with departed loved ones. The appeal of spiritualism was further enhanced by its compatibility with the broader currents of American religious thought during the Second Great Awakening, a period characterized by religious experimentation and the emergence of numerous new faiths. The burned-over district of upstate New York, so named for the intensity of religious revival that swept through the region, produced several significant religious movements including Mormonism, Seventh-day Adventism, and various utopian communities. Unlike many of these movements that remained relatively contained, spiritualism rapidly expanded beyond regional boundaries to become a national phenomenon.
I want to answer the question of what is Swedenborgianism, which many people are not familiar with the church because we're quite a small tradition. But the church is founded after the mystic Emanuel Swedenborg, who was a writer and a thinker during the Enlightenment period. He spent most of his life as a scientist and an intellectual, and then when he was in his 50s, he turned inward and started having these deep meditative experiences where he describes his spiritual eyes were opened, and he has experiences of the other life, of heaven and hell, and he came back, and using all of his skills as a scientist, he kind of takes these meticulous notes and records everything that he saw, and there are many volumes that have been written about his experiences. So the church looks to his writings and kind of tries to understand who we are based on what he saw of heaven and hell. There's much I could share about the tradition. Kind of the few things that are really important to me are first that heaven and hell are a place, heaven in particular is a place for all people. It's not just people who live by a certain doctrine or a certain tradition, but it's all people who live lives by the best that they know. And this was really important to me as a person in this time in history with many, friends and family of different traditions. So heaven is this place where our salvation is not about prescribing to a particular doctrine, but it's an inner experience of opening to love and to understanding. The other part of Swedenborg's experiences was he did a deep exegesis of the Bible, and he uncovered these deep levels of meaning within the scriptures, this inner sense within the story. And that inner sense corresponds to our own spiritual development and life. And one way to describe it is there's this journey from the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis to the holy city in the book of Revelation. And all of the tales within the biblical story from the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament are these ups and downs of the spiritual life, of freedom and captivity, of following the Lord through battles and challenges, and through that process coming to understand ourselves and our place in the grand design. So the tradition has a lot to do with spiritual growth, a recognition that we are kind of connected to the spiritual realm and that it's kind of peeking through the creation and all of the things that we see in the natural world and then also in the biblical story.
The catalyst that transformed these philosophical underpinnings into a full-fledged movement came in 1848 through the experiences of the Fox sisters in Hydesville, New York. This pivotal moment in spiritualist history began when the sisters claimed to have established communication with the spirit of a murdered peddler in their family home. The girls developed a system whereby the alleged spirit would respond to questions through a series of rappings or knocking sounds, establishing what would become the prototypical form of spirit communication in the spiritualist movement. The sisters insisted that the spirit identified himself as a peddler who had been murdered in their house by a previous tenant, creating a narrative that combined supernatural communication with a compelling story of justice from beyond the grave. News of these remarkable communications spread rapidly beyond Hydesville, creating such intense local interest that the girls were temporarily separated and sent to stay with relatives in nearby Rochester. Significantly, the mysterious rappings allegedly followed them to their new locations, with Kate staying with their older sister Leah in Rochester, while Margaretta resided with their brother David. This persistence of the phenomena beyond the original haunted house lent credibility to the sisters' claims while simultaneously suggesting that the girls themselves, rather than the house, were the conduit for spirit communication. This development would prove crucial in establishing the concept of the medium as an individual with special sensitivity to spirit communications, which became a central feature of spiritualist practice. The Fox sisters' spiritual demonstrations soon caught the attention of Amy and Isaac Post, a prominent Quaker couple deeply involved in various social reform movements, including abolition and women's rights. The Posts, who invited the Fox sisters into their Rochester home, provided both social legitimacy and access to their extensive network of progressive reformers. This connection between spiritualism and social reform would become one of the defining characteristics of the movement, establishing spiritualism not merely as a religious belief system, but as an impetus for social transformation. The Post's embrace of the Fox sisters helped to position spiritualism within the broader context of progressive reform movements that defined the pre-Civil War period in American history. Following its dramatic introduction through the Fox sisters, spiritualism expanded with remarkable speed across the United States during the late 1840s and throughout the 1850s. Moving beyond its origins in upstate New York, the movement gained significant followings in major urban centers and rural communities alike, spreading first throughout the Northeast and then westward. This expansion was facilitated by the development of a network of itinerant mediums who traveled extensively, conducting seances and delivering lectures on spiritualist philosophy. These traveling mediums functioned effectively as evangelists for the new movement, introducing spiritualist practices and beliefs to communities across the country while simultaneously adapting their presentations to appeal to local sensibilities and concerns. The rapid dissemination of spiritualist ideas was significantly enhanced by the emergence of dedicated periodicals that propagated the movement's teachings and reported on spiritualist phenomena. Publications such as the Shekinah, the Spiritual Telegraph, and the Spiritual Philosopher, edited by influential figures like S.B. Britton, William Fishbaugh, and La Roy Sunderland, created a sense of community among geographically dispersed believers while standardizing spiritualist doctrine and practice. These periodicals served both to introduce newcomers to spiritualist concepts and to provide experienced practitioners with accounts of phenomena observed in different locations, creating a shared body of evidence that bolstered believers' confidence in their experiences. The establishment of this spiritualist press marked an important step in the movement's development from localized phenomena to organized religion. By 1854, spiritualism had achieved sufficient organizational coherence to convene a national convention of spiritualists in New York, where delegates adopted a constitution founding the Society for the Dispensation of Spiritualist Truths. This formal organization represented a significant evolution for a movement that had initially emphasized individual experience and direct spiritual revelation over institutional authority. Lily Dale, located in southwestern New York State, stands as America's oldest and largest spiritualist community, where the belief in communication with the transitioned, not dead, has flourished since the late 19th century. This once small camp meeting ground has evolved into a vibrant spiritual center that continues to attract over 22,000 visitors annually, seeking connection with the spirit world through resident mediums and spiritual practices. Founded on principles born from the Fox sisters' spiritual communications in 1846, Lily Dale represents a fascinating intersection of religious innovation, social reform, and community growth that continues to thrive in contemporary America. Situated in the town of Pomfret on the east side of Cassadaga Lake, this location was ideal, about an hour from Buffalo and Erie, Pennsylvania, and just 30 minutes from Jamestown. It began as a summer camp for spiritualists, a place where folks could gather to explore spiritualism away from skeptical eyes. From its earliest days, Lily Dale was intended as a place to further the science, philosophy, and religion of spiritualism. The founders weren't just creating a retreat, they were establishing what would become the center of American spiritualist practice. The permanent population remained small. Even today, only about 275 people live here year-round. But from the beginning, the summer season transformed Lily Dale into a bustling center of spiritual activity, with visitors coming to experience this unique community. What made Lily Dale special was its intentional nature. This wasn't just a place where spiritualists happened to live. It was deliberately created as a community dedicated to spiritualist beliefs and practices. It brought together multiple strands of American cultural life: feminism, social reform, utopianism, and spiritual exploration. For spiritualists, death isn't really death at all. They typically avoid saying someone has died and instead use the term transitioned, meaning the person has simply moved to a different cosmological plane. One of the most fascinating aspects of Lily Dale's history is how central music and sound were to their spiritual practices. Music wasn't just for entertainment. It was considered a critical tool for activating spirit communication. Spiritualists developed a whole philosophy around vibrational physics to explain why music was so effective in facilitating contact with spirits. They believed certain sounds and frequencies could literally bridge the gap between our world and the spirit realm. Today, just as in its early years, Lily Dale transforms during the summer season. The year-round population of about 275 swells dramatically as an estimated 22,000 visitors arrive to experience this spiritual community. They come for classes, workshops, church services, and demonstrations of mediumship. The credibility and social reach of spiritualism was substantially enhanced by the conversion of numerous prominent Americans who lent their reputations and public platforms to the movement. New York Senator Nathaniel P. Talmadge, New York Appeals Judge J.W. Edmonds, and influential newspaper editor Horace Greeley were among the notable public figures whose interest in spiritualism helped to legitimize the movement in the eyes of many Americans. These high-profile converts not only participated in seances and other spiritualist activities, but also publicly defended the validity of spirit communications, often citing their own experiences as evidence. Their testimonials were particularly persuasive given their established reputations for rationality and judgment, qualities seemingly at odds with uncritical acceptance of supernatural claims. The involvement of these respected figures contributed to spiritualism's appeal across class boundaries, allowing the movement to attract followers from both elite and ordinary backgrounds. While many religious movements of the era remained confined to specific socioeconomic groups, spiritualism developed a remarkably diverse following that included wealthy urban professionals, middle-class reformers, and rural farmers. This social diversity reflected spiritualism's unusual ability to address spiritual concerns common to Americans of various backgrounds while adapting its practices to accommodate different social contexts and expectations. The movement's flexibility allowed it to maintain this broad appeal even as it developed more formalized structures and doctrines. Spiritualism's growth was further supported by its intellectual connections to other contemporary movements, including those founded by figures like John Humphrey Noyes, Robert Dale Owen, William Miller, and the Shakers, all of whom contributed either ideas or members to the new religion. These intellectual and personal exchanges created a rich environment in which spiritualist concepts could evolve and adapt, incorporating elements from various spiritual traditions while maintaining a distinctive identity. The resulting synthesis proved remarkably appealing to many Americans disillusioned with traditional religious institutions, yet unwilling to abandon spiritual beliefs entirely, positioning spiritualism as a modernized approach to faith compatible with progressive social values and scientific inquiry. One of the most revolutionary aspects of American spiritualism was its unprecedented elevation of women to positions of spiritual authority and public leadership. Unlike mainstream Protestant denominations that restricted women's religious roles, spiritualism actively encouraged female participation and leadership, particularly through the role of the medium. The movement promoted the belief that women were naturally superior as mediums due to their supposedly more delicate sensitive nervous systems, a notion that, while rooted in gender stereotypes of the era, nevertheless created unprecedented opportunities for women to exercise public religious authority. This theological justification for female leadership represented a significant departure from conventional religious practice and contributed substantially to spiritualism's progressive social character. The role of female mediums extended far beyond private seances into the public sphere, as women conducted public demonstrations of spirit communication and delivered lectures on spiritualist philosophy to mixed audiences. At a time when women's public speaking remained highly controversial, spiritualism provided one of the few socially acceptable platforms from which women could address audiences, including men. As noted in the historical record, for a time spiritualism was one of the only way that women were allowed to speak in public as acting as spiritualist mediums, with these women using this as a way to champion various causes. The public authority granted to female mediums thus challenged prevailing gender norms while creating opportunities for women to develop and demonstrate intellectual and rhetorical skills typically denied to them in other contexts. Spiritualism's commitment to social reform extended well beyond gender equality to encompass numerous progressive causes of the antebellum period. The movement developed strong connections to temperance, pacifism, women's rights, and educational reforms. These affiliations were not incidental but integral to spiritualist philosophy, which emphasized creating a social philosophy in which a man would be in harmony with nature, God, and his fellow man. Unlike some religious movements that focused exclusively on spiritual concerns or individual salvation, spiritualism explicitly connected spiritual development with social progress, positioning reform activism as a natural extension of spiritual enlightenment. The relationship between spiritualism and reform movements was mutually reinforcing, with many established reformers embracing spiritualist beliefs, while spiritualist circles became important venues for discussing and organizing reform initiatives.
So, Dr. Collins, you are a brilliant, brilliant scientist, the head of the Human Genome Project. Now, here's what's so puzzling, is that you are the one scientist, the one famous scientist anyway, who's also religious. Explain that to me.
I would argue that if you look at the evidence, that historical evidence of Christ's existence is overwhelming.
What evidence? I mean, I've never even heard anyone propose that there's evidence.
When I read the New Testament, it reads to me as the record of eyewitnesses who put down what they saw and heard.
You know they weren't eyewitnesses.
They were close to that. They
No.
were within a couple of decades of eyewitnesses.
Okay. Would that stand up in a laboratory as absolute, foolproof evidence that something happened?
A distinctive feature of American spiritualism that significantly contributed to its popular appeal was its self-presentation as a scientifically verifiable spiritual system. In an era increasingly characterized by scientific advancement and technological innovation, spiritualism positioned itself as the scientific religion compatible with modern knowledge rather than opposed to it. This framing responded to growing tensions between traditional religious beliefs and scientific discoveries by offering a middle path that claimed to satisfy both spiritual yearnings and demands for empirical evidence. Spiritualists argued that their practices could be subject to scientific verification through what they termed test conditions, controlled environments in which spirit communications could be observed and documented by objective witnesses. The scientific aspirations of spiritualism were evident in its extensive incorporation of contemporary scientific and pseudoscientific concepts. This scientific veneer provided intellectual respectability to spiritualist claims during a period when traditional religious explanations were increasingly questioned by educated Americans. The emphasis on empirical verification through mediumistic demonstrations conducted under test conditions represented a significant innovation in religious practice. Spiritualist seances frequently included elements designed to prevent fraud and ensure objective observation, such as binding or restraining mediums, conducting sessions in lighted rooms rather than darkness, and inviting skeptical observers to examine the physical environment before manifestations occurred. The influence of American spiritualism extended far beyond its formal adherence to shape broader cultural attitudes toward death, the afterlife, and the relationship between science and spirituality.